We've talked a bit about the G factor, and you distinguish it from spatial, numerical, verbal, other dimensions of intelligence that, well, I think you said the G factor is responsible for 50% or so
Of the variance in an IQ score. Yeah.
Mhm. And I'm wondering if the G factor on the one hand, and then the spatial, numerical, verbal, and so on dimensions of intelligence, if they each reflect distinct underlying structures or cognitive capacities of the brain, or if they're just useful terms for purposes of conceptual classification.
Well, it would be nice if you could find brain areas that were the mathematical areas or the verbal areas. And while there's some indication, especially for verbal, that there are certain brain structures like Broca's area, Wernicke's area, that are related to verbal ability. There aren't really comparable areas just for math, and parietal lobe is important for math. And whether or not there are areas that underlie the G factor was kind of an early question we had. The data are not so clear on these things because as brain imaging gets more sophisticated, just identifying areas where activity or density of gray matter correlate to something like a mathematics score or a verbal score or a G score, it turns out the connectivity of the areas is just as important as what goes on in the areas themselves. So the idea is to identify the brain networks, not just the areas, but how those areas communicate with other areas. And whether or not there are special networks for the G factor is not so clear, although there's a lot of data on it that are very intriguing. And I talk about this new data. It's relatively new over the last couple of years, using very sophisticated analysis of brain images to ask questions about functional and structural connectivity measurements of the brain and how they relate to individual differences in psychometric IQ scores. And they do. And it's very interesting work. It's certainly a long way from the 1988 paper we published, just showing a small number of areas where a small number of areas poorly defined at the time were related to these psychometric scores.
The existence of the positive manifold, though, that you mentioned earlier, certainly suggests that all these areas are entangled, whatever they are, whatever they may be.
Yes, and it's worse than that. It's not only are all the areas, they're not entangled randomly. There's order there, and researchers are trying to figure out the order. That's the neuroimaging part. But now if you ask the question, how do genes influence, what's the relationship between genes and the neuroimaging part? Now you have DNA analysis, and you have this relatively recent concept of polygenic scores. Polygenic scores, they're like all new innovations, they become more controversial with time, not less. As they generate more data and people begin to see weaknesses that weren't obvious when they first started being used. But a polygenic score is there if you can identify genes that are related to intelligence. And a lot of genes have been related to intelligence. When this started, the hope was you'd have a handful of genes, and then it would be a relatively straightforward, easy problem to figure out what those genes do. Well, it turns out, no surprise, the brain is more complex, and there are hundreds, maybe 1,000 genes, each weakly related to psychometric IQ scores. And when I say gene, your audience should understand that genes come in variants, and these can be called single poly, single poly, well, single poly. I'm sorry, I'm not.
Polymorphisms?
Yes, thank you. And they're abbreviated SNPs. And you can measure SNPs in
Snip
people.
chips.
Yes. And you can give to make a really simple example, you measure the SNPs related to intelligence. In a person, you measure how many of those intelligence-related SNPs does that person have. And the more SNPs related to intelligence that person has, the higher their polygenic score. Now, you can give these scores in different ways, and you can weight them in different ways. But the point is, you then have a genetic metric that you can correlate with psychometric scores, for example. And you can see that whether or not people with high polygenic scores for IQ, in fact, get high IQ scores. And right now, the best data seem to indicate that polygenic scores predict somewhere between 10 and 20% of the variance. Relatively small amount. But it's not clear any other variable predicts more.
Is it predicted that, or expected that the correlation will become higher as the sophistication of what goes into the polygenic score becomes more sophisticated?
This is the hope, but there appears to be some limits to this, because as the studies became more sophisticated with larger and larger sample sizes, people said you might need 1 million people. And researchers said you might need 1 million people. Well, there was a study published with 1 million people, and the incremental amount of variance explained by the polygenic score didn't increase that much. So it looks like there may be a cap on this. And then there's also this other mystery of why polygenic scores seem to predict less variance in intelligence than you would think based on identical twin studies and behavioral genetics, where estimates were around 50%, if not more, depending on the age of the person. So there are a lot of mysteries here still, but we're a far cry from when I started in 1971. Is genetics involved or not? There are critics of this whole enterprise who argue that fundamentally you cannot make progress in this area because you think brain areas are entangled and complicated. Well, the genetic story is even more complicated because gene expression can be, doesn't have to be, but gene expression can be influenced by environmental variables like stress. They can be influenced by other genetic variables. And there's always random chance in the mix that affects how genes express themselves. So it's a terribly complicated mix of things. Some geneticists believe it's so complicated you can never disentangle things enough to not only say how much it's genetics involved compared to environment, but you can never really identify biological causal mechanisms that are influenced by the genetics. Other people, and I would include myself in the other people category, look to the history of science. I'm not an expert in genetics by any means, but they look to the history of science, and they say science is all about figuring out complex things, and just because it's complex and multidimensional, multi-determined, and highly interactive doesn't mean that at some point we won't be able to figure out something that's causally relevant about the neurobiology of intelligence. And that is where I think the whole field is going. I think all intelligence research is moving in this much more fundamental neuroscience direction for the purpose of understanding the neurobiological mechanisms that underlie individual differences in intelligence to the point where we can come up with ways to tweak those mechanisms with the possibility of dramatically increasing the G factor. Not IQ scores, I'm talking about the latent G factor.
Pharmacologically or through gene therapy or something like that?
It's an empirical question, either through gene therapy or through intervening in some final common pathway. You know, if you got a whole bunch of genes, each with a tiny influence, but a group of them are relevant to the dynamics of a particular neurotransmitter, then that's a hint that manipulating aspects of that neurotransmitter might have some impact on intelligence. I'm choosing my words carefully because when I say manipulating the impact of a neurotransmitter, I mean, you got synaptic events, you got presynaptic, postsynaptic, you got a whole bunch of stuff happening at the level of the synapse. Molecular biologists are the people who diligently figure that out. Takes forever. But there are groups all over the world working on these things. So with a little coordination and some time and effort and funding, it may be that I doubt I'll live to see it, but at some point in the future, we will know a heck of a lot more about the neurobiology of intelligence that we know today.
But you think that psychometrics will still be around?
Psychometrics will be crucial to the teams working on this to get a sophisticated measurement of intelligence rather than just a single test score, or rather than a proxy like educational attainment, which is a proxy for IQ.
Right. You need to be able to measure these neurobiological findings against something behaviorally. So that's why the psychometric data is going to continue to be very important.
Yes. And when you think about on one side, we have multi-million-dollar sophistication of neuroimaging techniques, DNA analysis. And on the other side, we have an IQ score. That's a paper and pencil test that's been used for decades. So certainly, if there's a way to match the sophistication of the neurobiology measures to the behavioral measure, that will help move the field forward as well. But I think psychometrics is for the time being is going to play an important role here. So now what you have is these multinational consortia working on collecting neuroimaging, DNA, cognitive tests, and you have people putting these things together. And that's very, very powerful.